The Ashford Grand Ballroom glowed with crystal chandeliers and soft golden light. Every surface polished perfection for the city's most anticipated charity gala of the year. 300 guests filled the enormous room. Women in designer gowns, men in tailored tuxedos. Champagne glasses clinking softly beneath the sound of a live string quartet playing near the entrance. It was the kind of event where everyone who mattered in the city came to be seen, where business deals were quietly arranged between dances, and where social standing was measured in the cut of one's suit and the weight of one's jewelry. Ethan Cross walked to the grand entrance wearing a simple black jacket over a plain white shirt, clothes that looked comfortable and unremarkable rather than expensive or fashionable. He carried himself quietly, his expression calm and unreadable, moving through the crowd without seeking attention or acknowledgement from anyone around him. Almost immediately, heads began to turn. "Who let him in?" A woman in an emerald gown whispered to her companion, her eyes sweeping over Ethan's simple clothing with obvious disdain. "He looks like he wandered in from the parking lot." Her companion laughed softly behind a gloved hand. "Someone should tell security." Ethan heard the comments clearly, though his expression never changed. He continued moving through the ballroom at an unhurried pace, accepting a glass of water from a passing waiter rather than the champagne being offered to other guests, his eyes scanning the room with quiet, careful attention that suggested he was looking for someone specific rather than simply enjoying the party. Richard Ashford, the evening's host and one of the city's most prominent businessmen, stood near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by an admiring circle of guests, his silver hair perfectly styled, his tuxedo tailored to precise perfection. Richard had built his real estate empire from a modest inheritance decades earlier, transforming it into one of the largest development companies on the East Coast through calculated ambition and an unwavering belief in his own superiority over those he considered beneath him. He noticed Ethan from across the room, his expression shifting immediately into something between confusion and contempt. "Excuse me," Richard said, breaking away from a circle of admirers and crossing the ballroom floor with deliberate, confident steps. The crowd around him parted slightly, sensing an unfolding moment worth watching. Ethan turned as Richard approached, his expression remaining perfectly calm despite the obvious hostility radiating from the older man. "This is a private event," Richard said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure nearby guests could hear clearly. "I don't believe we've met, and frankly, your attire suggests you made some kind of mistake about which event you're attending tonight." Several guests nearby chuckled quietly at Richard's pointed comment, their attention now fully focused on the unfolding confrontation. "I was invited," Ethan said simply, his voice calm and even despite the public humiliation clearly building around him. Richard's eyebrows rose skeptically. "Invited by whom exactly?" "This gala requires a formal invitation, and I assure you, my guest list doesn't include anyone dressed like they're heading to a hardware store." More laughter rippled through the surrounding crowd. Ethan remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged, though something sharp and calculating flickered briefly behind his dark eyes, gone almost before anyone could notice it. "There seems to be some confusion," Ethan said quietly. "I received an invitation directly." "I find that highly unlikely," Richard said, his tone growing sharper, clearly enjoying the attention his public confrontation was generating among the watching crowd. "Perhaps you should reconsider your evening plans. This particular gathering isn't quite suited to your circumstances." The insult landed clearly, deliberately cruel, despite its polished delivery. Several guests laughed openly now, enjoying the spectacle of watching Richard Ashford put an obviously out-of-place stranger firmly in his social position. Ethan studied Richard for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his calm expression. Then, without argument or protest, he simply nodded once. "Of course," Ethan said quietly. "My apologies for confusion." He set down his half-finished glass of water on a nearby table and turned to leave, walking calmly toward the ballroom's grand entrance while whispered laughter and pointed comments followed him across the polished marble floor. "Can you believe the nerve?" someone murmured as he passed. "Showing up somewhere he clearly doesn't belong." Ethan said nothing, his expression remaining perfectly composed despite the public humiliation trailing behind him like an unwelcome shadow. He had almost reached the entrance when a sharp, startled gasp cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom. Marcus Bellwether, a a longtime real estate developer who had done considerable business throughout the city over the past 2 decades, had been standing near the entrance speaking quietly with a colleague. His eyes had landed on Ethan's retreating figure, and his face had gone completely, visibly pale. "Oh my God," Marcus whispered, his champagne glass slipping slightly in his suddenly trembling hand. "Do you know who that is?" His colleague frowned, confused. "Some man Richard just threw out, apparently." "That's Ethan Cross," Marcus said, his voice barely audible, though the words seemed to carry an electric current through everyone standing close enough to hear them. "That's the Cross organization. He controls half the ports on this coast. People who cross him disappear, and nobody ever finds them." The colleague's face drained of color instantly. "You're certain?" "I've seen his photograph exactly once, years ago, in a file I was never supposed to see," Marcus whispered urgently. "That's him. That's absolutely him." The whisper spread to the ballroom like wildfire, guest to guest, growing louder and more panicked with each passing second. Richard Ashford, still standing near the center of the room basking in his moment of social triumph, remained entirely unaware that he had just publicly humiliated the most feared and powerful mafia boss on the entire East Coast in front of every important person in the city. Ethan Cross stepped out into the cool evening air outside the Ashford estate, the sounds of panicked whispers fading behind him as the grand doors closed. His driver, a broad-shouldered man named Dominic who had served him faithfully for over a decade, opened the car door immediately upon seeing him approach. "How did it go, sir?" Dominic asked carefully, studying Ethan's calm but unreadable expression. "About as expected," Ethan said simply, settling into the back seat of the black sedan. To understand exactly what had unfolded inside that ballroom, and why Ethan Cross had chosen to attend wearing clothes that invited exactly the kind of humiliation he received, required understanding who he truly was beneath the calm, unassuming exterior he presented that evening. At 36 years old, Ethan Cross controlled one of the most powerful criminal organizations on the entire East Coast. He had inherited leadership from his father 12 years earlier, following a violent power struggle that had claimed his father's life and forced Ethan, barely 24 at the time, to consolidate control over an organization many believed he was far too young and inexperienced to lead successfully. He had proven them wrong decisively. Within 5 years, Ethan had expanded his organization's influence significantly, absorbing smaller rival operations, establishing dominant control over the city's ports and shipping routes, and building a reputation for ruthless, calculated efficiency that made even seasoned criminals speak his name with genuine fear. Yet despite the violence and danger inherent in his position, Ethan had always maintained a carefully guarded separation between his criminal empire and his personal life, a boundary he protected with the same calculated precision he applied to every aspect of his dangerous business. His attendance at the Ashford Charity Gala that evening had nothing to do with his criminal organization at all. It connected to something far more personal, a promise made years earlier to someone whose memory Ethan still carried carefully, privately, separate from the ruthless reputation that defined his public existence. Elizabeth Ashford, Richard's younger sister, had been Ethan's closest friend during his difficult teenage years, back before his father's violent death had forced him into the dangerous world he now controlled completely. Elizabeth had been kind to him during a period when few others bothered, treating him with genuine warmth despite the obvious differences in their social circumstances even then. She had passed away 8 years earlier, a sudden illness taking her far too young, and Ethan had quietly funded the charity foundation established in her memory ever since, though he had always done so anonymously, never seeking recognition or acknowledgement for his substantial ongoing contributions. Tonight's gala had been organized specifically to celebrate the foundation's decade of charitable work that had genuinely helped thousands of underprivileged children access proper education and health care throughout the city. Ethan had wanted, for the first time, to attend quietly and witness firsthand the genuine impact of contributions he'd made faithfully every year since Elizabeth's passing. He had deliberately chosen simple, unremarkable clothing, hoping to observe the event and its genuine charitable impact without drawing attention to himself or revealing his true identity and connection to Elizabeth's memory. He had never anticipated that Richard, the brother who had barely acknowledged Ethan's existence during Elizabeth's lifetime, despite her genuine friendship with him, would publicly humiliate him so thoroughly in front of the very crowd gathered to honor his sister's memory. "Take me back to the estate," Ethan told Dominic quietly, settling back against the car seat as they pulled away from the Ashford property. "Sir," Dominic said carefully, glancing at him through the rearview mirror, "word is already spreading through the city about what happened tonight. Richard Ashford humiliating you publicly, guests recognizing you afterward. This is going to create significant complications." "I'm aware," Ethan said simply, his expression giving nothing away despite the genuine complexity of emotions he carried privately regarding the evening's events. Behind Ethan's calm exterior, however, complicated feelings churned that even Dominic, despite years of loyal service, couldn't fully perceive. The humiliation itself meant little to Ethan personally. He had endured far worse throughout his difficult life and dangerous career. What genuinely troubled him was the realization that Richard Ashford, Elizabeth's own brother, had built such profound arrogance and cruelty into his character that he would publicly humiliate a stranger without a moment's hesitation, seemingly enjoying the cruelty rather than questioning it. It made Ethan wonder uncomfortably exactly what kind of man his beloved friend's brother had truly become during the years since her passing. Meanwhile, back at the Ashford estate, panic had fully consumed the previously celebratory atmosphere of the gala. Richard, still unaware of exactly who he'd humiliated, noticed a sudden shift in mood among his guests with growing confusion. "What's happening?" he asked one of his business associates, noting the pale faces and urgent whispers spreading rapidly through the crowd. "Richard," the associate said carefully, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm, "the man you just threw out, do you have any idea who that actually was?" "Some uninvited stranger," Richard said dismissively, though uncertainty was beginning to creep into his previously confident tone. "That was Ethan Cross," the associate said, his voice dropping to a near whisper despite the urgency of his warning. "The Cross organization. He controls the ports, the shipping routes, half the underground business throughout this entire coast. People don't cross him and simply walk away unscathed, Richard. Ever." Richard felt the blood drain slowly from his face as the full weight of the associate's words settled into his understanding. "That's impossible," he said, though his voice carried none of its earlier confident dismissiveness. "He was dressed like—" "I don't care what he was wearing," the associate interrupted urgently. Marcus Bellwether confirmed it personally. "He's seen Cross's photograph before, in files related to certain business transactions best left unmentioned in polite company. That was absolutely him, Richard, and you just humiliated him publicly in front of 300 witnesses." Richard's mind raced desperately backward to the confrontation, replaying his cutting comments, the public laughter he'd encouraged among his guests, the deliberate cruelty he'd inflicted on a man who now represented potentially the single most dangerous mistake of his entire career and life. "I need to fix this," Richard said, panic evident beneath his usually confident exterior. "Immediately." "I'm not certain that's possible," the associate said grimly. "Men like Cross don't typically forgive public humiliation easily, regardless of apology or explanation offered afterward." Richard felt genuine fear settling into his chest for the first time that evening, understanding with growing dread that his careless cruelty toward an apparent stranger had potentially exposed himself, his business empire, and his entire family to consequences far more severe than simple social embarrassment. What Richard didn't yet know, couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that his business empire was already crumbling under crushing debt hidden carefully from public knowledge, debt that would soon require exactly the kind of powerful, resourceful assistance that only someone like Ethan Cross could realistically provide. The timing of tonight's catastrophic humiliation couldn't have been worse for Richard Ashford's increasingly desperate circumstances. Long after the last guest had departed the Ashford estate that evening, Richard sat alone in his private study, a glass of untouched whiskey resting on his desk beside a thick folder of financial documents he'd spent the past 6 months desperately trying to hide from public knowledge. The truth, one Richard had shared with no one beyond his most trusted financial advisor, was considerably darker than the public perception of his thriving real estate empire suggested. A series of failed development projects, combined with poorly timed investments and a costly legal battle over a disputed property acquisition, had left Ashford Development drowning under nearly $40 million of debt, obligations that would come due within the next 90 days. Richard had spent months quietly seeking solutions, approaching traditional banks who had grown increasingly wary of his company's deteriorating financial position, exploring emergency loans from private investors who demanded interest rates that would only accelerate his company's collapse rather than genuinely solving the underlying crisis. Tonight's gala, ironically, had been partly intended as a public demonstration of Ashford Development's continued success and stability, a carefully orchestrated performance meant to reassure nervous investors and business partners who might otherwise begin questioning the company's genuine financial health. That careful performance now lay in ruins, replaced by the far more urgent and terrifying reality that Richard had publicly humiliated the one person in the entire city who possessed both the resources and the connections to potentially save his crumbling empire from complete collapse. His financial advisor, a sharp, calculating woman named Diane Chun, who had worked alongside Richard for nearly 15 years, arrived at his study early the following morning, her expression grave as she settled into the chair across from his desk. "I've spent the entire night making calls," Diane said without preamble, attempting to determine exactly how significant tonight's incident might become for our company's already precarious position. "And?" Richard asked, dreading her assessment despite already anticipating its likely severity. "Several of our primary business partners have already reached out with concerns," Diane said carefully. "Word travels remarkably fast in circles where Ethan Cross's reputation carries the weight it does. Two of our lending institutions specifically mentioned reconsidering their continued involvement with our company, citing concerns about associating with someone who has apparently made a significant enemy within organizations they prefer not naming directly." Richard felt his chest tighten with genuine dread. "They're pulling out because of this?" "They're expressing serious hesitation," Diane clarified, "which, given our company's already fragile financial position, could prove absolutely catastrophic if it develops into full withdrawal of their continued support." Richard buried his face in his hands, the weight of his careless cruelty from the previous evening settling into genuine, crushing regret. "I had no idea who he was, Diane. He looked like—" "I understand the circumstances," Diane interrupted, though her tone carried little genuine sympathy. "But understanding doesn't change our current predicament. We need Ethan Cross's continued goodwill, or at minimum, his neutral indifference, if we have any hope of navigating our current financial crisis successfully." "What are you suggesting exactly?" Richard asked, though he suspected he already understood the uncomfortable direction Diane's assessment was heading. "I'm suggesting," Diane said carefully, "that beyond simply hoping Cross doesn't actively work against our company's interests, we might actually need to approach him directly for assistance. His organization has significant resources and connections throughout industries that could genuinely help stabilize our current situation, assuming he's willing to consider such an arrangement despite last night's unfortunate circumstances." Richard stared at her in genuine disbelief. "You want to ask the man I publicly humiliated last night for financial assistance?" "I want you to consider every available option," Diane said firmly, "given that our alternatives are becoming increasingly limited with each passing day. Our current debt obligations don't simply disappear because approaching potential solutions feels personally uncomfortable, Richard." Richard sat in heavy silence for several long minutes, processing the genuine complexity of his predicament. Pride warred fiercely against pragmatic necessity within his chest, the humiliation of potentially begging assistance from someone he'd publicly mocked colliding directly against the very real possibility of losing everything he'd spent his entire career building. "Let me think about this," Richard said finally, though uncertainty was evident in his tired voice. "You don't have unlimited time to consider your options," Diane warned seriously. "Our creditors are already growing restless, and word of last night's incident will only accelerate their concerns if we don't address the situation proactively rather than allowing panic to spread further unchecked." After Diane departed, Richard remained alone in his study, staring at the mounting financial documents that represented years of ambitious dreams now teetering precariously on the edge of complete collapse. He thought about his sister Elizabeth, gone 8 years now, and the charitable foundation established in her memory that tonight's gala had been meant to celebrate. He thought, too, uncomfortably, about the stranger he'd humiliated so thoroughly, wondering with growing unease exactly what connection, if any, that man might possess to justify his presence at an event specifically honoring Elizabeth's memory and charitable legacy. Richard pulled out his phone and After several minutes of hesitation, dialed a number he'd obtained through his associate the previous evening, a contact number for reaching Ethan Cross's organization through appropriate, formal channels. The call connected after several rings, a calm, professional voice answering without identifying themselves specifically. "I need to speak with Mr. Cross," Richard said, his voice carrying more uncertainty than he'd intended. "This is Richard Ashford. I believe we encountered each other last evening, and I'd like the opportunity to apologize properly and discuss a matter of some importance." There was a brief pause on the line before the voice responded carefully. "Mr. Cross doesn't typically take unscheduled calls, Mr. Ashford. I'll relay your message and see whether he's interested in arranging a meeting." The call ended abruptly, leaving Richard uncertain whether his desperate outreach had accomplished anything meaningful or simply confirmed his organization's awareness of exactly how thoroughly he'd humiliated himself and his company's future through the previous evening's careless cruelty. 3 days passed without response, days during which Richard watched with growing horror as 2 additional business partners formally withdrew their continued financial support, citing vague but clearly connected concerns about his company's stability and associated risks. On the 4th day, as Richard sat in his office reviewing increasingly desperate financial projections with Diane, his assistant knocked urgently at his door. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice carrying unmistakable tension, "there's a car here. They say Mr. Cross is prepared to meet with you now, if you're available." Richard felt his heart race with a complicated mixture of relief and genuine apprehension. Whatever conversation awaited him would likely determine not just his company's immediate financial future, but potentially reveal exactly how severely his careless public cruelty had damaged any possibility of receiving the assistance his crumbling empire so desperately required. "Tell them I'll be right down," Richard said, standing slowly, gathering what remained of his composure for what promised to be one of the most significant and uncomfortable conversations of his entire career. Richard was led into a private meeting room at a downtown building he'd never previously known belonged to Ethan Cross's extensive holdings, an elegant but understated space with dark wood paneling and a single long table dominating the center of the room. Dominic stood near the entrance, his expression carefully neutral as he gestured Richard toward a seat. Ethan entered several minutes later, no longer wearing the simple, unremarkable clothing from the gala, but instead a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that somehow made his earlier disguise all the more striking in retrospect. He settled into a chair across from Richard without offering a greeting, his expression carrying the same calm, unreadable quality Richard remembered from their previous, disastrous encounter. "Mr. Cross," Richard began, his carefully rehearsed apology already feeling inadequate given the weight of Ethan's steady, assessing gaze. "I want to begin by offering my sincere apology for my behavior at the gala. I had no idea who you were, and regardless of that ignorance, my treatment of you was inexcusable." Ethan studied him for a long moment before responding. "You humiliated a stranger publicly, for entertainment, without any knowledge of who they actually were or what circumstances brought them to your event. That behavior remains equally inexcusable whether the person you humiliated happened to be powerful or genuinely powerless." The pointed observation landed uncomfortably close to truths Richard had been avoiding examining too closely about his own character. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "That doesn't excuse what I did, regardless of who you turn out to be." "No," Ethan agreed simply, "it doesn't." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them before Richard, understanding he had little choice but to address the actual purpose of this meeting directly, continued carefully. "I understand if my apology means little to you at this point, but I'm also here because my company is facing significant financial difficulties, and I'm hoping we might discuss the possibility of your organization's assistance, despite the obvious tension between us." Ethan's expression remained unreadable. "You're asking for my help immediately after apologizing for humiliating me." "I understand how that appears," Richard said, genuine discomfort evident in his voice. "But my company's crisis existed before our encounter at the gala, and addressing it properly would benefit not just myself, but hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depend on Ashford Development's continued stability." Ethan considered this for a long moment, his sharp eyes studying Richard carefully. "Tell me about your sister," he said finally, the unexpected question catching Richard completely off guard. "Elizabeth?" Richard asked, confusion evident in his expression. "Why would you ask about her?" Humor me, Ethan said simply. Richard hesitated, uncertain why this line of questioning had emerged during what he'd expected to be a purely business-focused conversation. She passed away 8 years ago. Sudden illness. The gala you attended was actually organized to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the charitable foundation established in her memory. Something shifted almost imperceptibly behind Ethan's controlled expression. Were you close with her? Richard considered the question honestly, uncomfortable memories surfacing that he rarely allowed himself to examine too closely. Not as close as I probably should have been, he admitted quietly. Elizabeth was considerably younger than me, and I was often too focused on building my career during her teenage years to invest properly in our relationship. I've regretted that distance considerably since her passing. She had friends during those years, Ethan said carefully, people from circumstances quite different from your family's social standing. Do you remember any of them? Richard frowned, genuinely searching his memory. Vaguely. There was a boy she spent considerable time with during high school, someone from a difficult family situation. If I remember correctly, I never paid much attention to their friendship. Honestly, I considered it beneath our family's social circle at the time, which I recognize now as a rather shameful attitude to hold. His name was Ethan. Ethan said quietly. Richard's eyes widened slowly as understanding began settling into a shocked expression. You knew Elizabeth. She was the only person who ever treated me with genuine kindness during one of the most difficult periods of my life, Ethan said, his controlled voice carrying unmistakable emotion beneath its careful composure. After my father's death forced me into circumstances I never wanted, Elizabeth remained one of the only people who continued treating me as a person worthy of basic respect and friendship, rather than judging me based on my family's reputation. Richard sat in stunned silence, the pieces of this unexpected revelation reorganizing his entire understanding of the previous evening's catastrophic encounter. You attended the gala because of your connection to Elizabeth. I've funded that foundation anonymously since her passing, Ethan confirmed. I wanted, for the first time, to witness firsthand the genuine impact of contributions I made faithfully every year in her memory. Instead, I found myself publicly humiliated by her own brother, someone she often spoke of with complicated affection despite the obvious distance between you. The weight of this revelation settled heavily onto Richard's shoulders, understanding now with painful clarity exactly how deeply his careless cruelty had wounded someone genuinely connected to his sister's memory. I had no idea, he said, his voice thick with genuine, mortified regret. If I had known, you would have treated me differently, Ethan finished, something sharp and knowing evident in his tone. Which is precisely the problem, Richard. Your respect and kindness shouldn't depend entirely on someone's perceived social standing or usefulness to you. Richard absorbed this pointed criticism with genuine humility, recognizing its fundamental truth despite how uncomfortable it felt to confront directly. You're right, he said quietly. That's exactly the kind of person I've apparently become, and I'm genuinely ashamed of it. Ethan studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his careful expression. I haven't decided yet whether I'm interested in assisting your company's financial situation, he said finally. Your apology, while seemingly genuine, doesn't automatically earn my trust or business partnership given the circumstances of our introduction. I understand, Richard said, genuine acceptance evident in his tired voice. I don't feel entitled to your assistance, regardless of any connection to Elizabeth's memory. I simply hoped you might be willing to consider it. Before Ethan could respond further, Dominic entered the room quietly, leaning down to speak urgently near Ethan's ear. Ethan's expression sharpened noticeably at whatever information Dominic was relaying. What is it? Richard asked, noticing the sudden shift in tension. Ethan turned back toward him, his expression now carrying genuine concern rather than the careful reserve he'd maintained throughout their difficult conversation. It appears your financial difficulties have attracted attention beyond simply nervous business partners and lending institutions. What do you mean? Richard asked, dread building steadily in his chest. The Moretti organization has apparently been monitoring your company's deteriorating financial position for several weeks, Ethan said grimly. They're moving aggressively to acquire significant portions of your remaining assets through what my sources describe as considerably less legal channels than typical business acquisition. Richard felt genuine fear settle into his chest for the first time since their difficult conversation began. That's not simply a business acquisition, is it? No, Ethan confirmed. That's a hostile takeover backed by an organization considerably more dangerous than typical business competitors. If they're moving against you now, Richard, your company's crisis has escalated well beyond simple financial difficulty into genuine, immediate danger. The Moretti organization? Richard repeated, his voice carrying genuine alarm. I've never had any dealings with them. Why would they target my company specifically? Opportunity, Ethan said simply. Your company's public financial vulnerability, combined with valuable real estate holdings across several strategic locations throughout the city, makes Ashford Development an attractive target for organizations that specialize in exploiting exactly this kind of weakness. What does that mean for me, practically speaking? Richard asked, dread building steadily as he processed the genuine severity of Ethan's warning. It means, Ethan said carefully, that the Moretti organization typically doesn't limit their pressure tactics to simple financial maneuvering. They're known for applying considerably more direct, personal pressure when acquiring companies through their preferred methods. Richard felt his blood run cold at the implication clearly embedded within Ethan's careful phrasing. Are you saying my family could be in danger? Before Ethan could respond, his phone buzzed sharply with an incoming call. He answered immediately, his expression growing increasingly grim as he listened to whatever information was being relayed. When? Ethan asked sharply, standing abruptly from his chair. What's happening? Richard demanded, panic evident in his voice. Ethan ended the call and turned to face Richard directly, his expression carrying genuine urgency now. Your daughter, Charlotte. She attends university at Hendrix College, correct? Yes, Richard said, terror flooding through his chest. Why? My sources indicate suspicious activity near her dormitory over the past several hours, Ethan said grimly. Unfamiliar vehicles, unusual surveillance patterns consistent with organizations preparing to apply exactly the kind of personal pressure I just described. Richard's hands began trembling as the genuine severity of the situation fully registered. You think they're going to target Charlotte? To pressure me into surrender my company. It's a common tactic, Ethan confirmed. Threatening or leveraging family members represents a considerably faster path to acquiring reluctant business assets than navigating complicated legal channels. We need to reach her immediately, Richard said, already reaching for his phone with shaking hands. Calling her directly might alert whoever is watching that we're aware of their surveillance, Ethan warned. I need you to trust me on this, Richard, despite everything that's happened between us. My organization has resources and experience dealing with exactly this kind of threat. Richard hesitated only a moment before nodding, understanding with genuine clarity that his pride and previous cruelty toward Ethan now mattered considerably less than his daughter's immediate safety. Please, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Whatever you need to do, please help her. Ethan nodded once and immediately began issuing rapid instructions to Dominic, who left the room quickly to coordinate with additional security personnel. Within minutes, Ethan's organization had mobilized considerable resources towards Charlotte's university location, moving with a speed and coordination that left Richard genuinely stunned despite his fear. How can you move this quickly? Richard asked, watching Ethan coordinate the operation with calm, practiced efficiency. This isn't the first time my organization has needed to respond rapidly to exactly this kind of threat, Ethan said simply, not looking up from the tablet displaying real-time updates from his security team's approach toward the university. The following hour passed with agonizing slowness for Richard, who paced anxiously while Ethan monitored the unfolding situation with focused, controlled attention. Diane arrived partway through the tense waiting period, having been summoned urgently, her expression carrying genuine alarm at the crisis now unfolding. Sir, Dominic's voice came through Ethan's phone speaker eventually. We secured the perimeter around Miss Ashford's dormitory. 2 vehicles matching the surveillance pattern departed the area approximately 10 minutes before our arrival. Casualties? Ethan asked sharply. None, sir. Miss Ashford is safe and currently unaware of the situation. We're maintaining discreet protection around her location. Richard felt overwhelming relief flood through his chest at this news, though tension remained evident in his posture. They didn't reach her? Not this time, Ethan confirmed, though his expression remained serious. But this confirms the Moretti organization is actively pursuing exactly the kind of pressure tactics I described. This threat isn't resolved simply because tonight's attempt was unsuccessful. What do we do now? Richard asked, genuine desperation evident in his voice. Ethan considered the question carefully before responding. I'm going to extend my organization's protection to your entire family, effective immediately. Charlotte, your wife, and yourself will require continuous security until we properly address the Moretti organization's aggressive interest in your company. Why would you do this? Richard asked, genuine confusion mixing with his relief. After everything that happened between us, why help so extensively? Ethan was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because Elizabeth would have wanted me to protect her family, regardless of how her brother treated me at a charity gala organized in her memory. Some obligations transcend personal grievances, Richard. The genuine weight of Ethan's response settled heavily into Richard's understanding, humbling him considerably beyond even his earlier apology's acknowledgement of his own poor character. I don't deserve this kind of generosity, he said quietly. Probably not. Ethan agreed simply, though without genuine cruelty in his tone. But my assistance isn't contingent on your deserving it. It's contingent on protecting people connected to Elizabeth's memory, and by extension, ensuring the Moretti organization doesn't successfully expand their dangerous influence throughout territory I consider my own responsibility to protect. Over the following days, Ethan's organization worked methodically to address the Moretti threat, gathering intelligence about their specific plans while simultaneously providing comprehensive security around Richard's family and remaining business assets. Richard found himself observing this efficient, controlled response with growing respect for the man he'd so carelessly humiliated days earlier, understanding increasingly the genuine competence and calculated intelligence underlying Ethan's controlled, unassuming exterior. On the fourth day of increased tension, Ethan called an urgent meeting with Richard, his expression carrying particular grim determination Richard had come to recognize as indicating significant developments. We've identified the Moretti organization's specific plan, Ethan said without preamble as Richard settled into his now familiar seat across the meeting table. They're planning a direct confrontation at your company's headquarters tomorrow evening, intending to force your signature on documents transferring significant ownership stakes under threat of violence against your family. Tomorrow, Richard repeated, alarm evident in his voice. That's remarkably fast. They're aware their initial surveillance attempt failed, Ethan explained. Organizations like Moretti typically accelerate their timeline when they suspect their targets have gained additional protection or awareness of their plans. What do we do? Richard asked, genuine trust now evident in how readily he deferred to Ethan's judgment despite their difficult history. Ethan's expression turned resolute. We ensure they walk into a situation considerably different from what they're anticipating. The following evening, Asher Development's headquarters stood quiet and dimly lit, appearing exactly as vulnerable and undefended as the Moretti organization anticipated. Richard sat at his office on the top floor, following Ethan's careful instructions to remain calm and cooperative in appearance, though his heart pounded with genuine anxiety, despite the reassurance of knowing Ethan's men were positioned strategically throughout the building. At exactly 8 o'clock, 3 black vehicles pulled into the underground parking garage. 6 men emerged, moving with the practiced confidence of people accustomed to intimidating their targets into rapid compliance. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man named Salvatore Moretti, entered the building's private elevator with an air of casual, dangerous authority. Richard heard the elevator chime softly as it reached his floor, his hands tightening involuntarily on the armrest of his chair despite Ethan's earlier instructions to project calm composure. Salvatore entered Richard's office without knocking, 5 armed men flanking him as he crossed the room with unhurried, confident steps. Mr. Ashford, he said, his voice carrying pleasant menace, I trust you had time to consider our proposal carefully. I need more time, Richard said, following Ethan's careful script exactly. This is a significant decision, and I'd like additional consultation with my legal advisors before. You don't have additional time, Salvatore interrupted sharply, his casual demeanor hardening noticeably. We're not interested in extended negotiations, Mr. Ashford. You'll sign these documents tonight, where your daughter's continued safety becomes considerably less certain. Before Richard could respond, the office door opened again, and Ethan cross-stepped inside, his expression calm despite the obvious tension filling the room. Salvatore's confident expression shifted instantly into genuine alarm. "Cross," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and barely controlled fear. "What are you doing here?" "Protecting an ally," Ethan said simply, his calm tone carrying unmistakable authority despite its quiet delivery. "This isn't your territory or business," Salvatore said, though his confident posture had noticeably deteriorated at Ethan's unexpected arrival. "Ashford Development operates within territory I consider my responsibility," Ethan corrected calmly, "which makes your organization's aggressive interest in acquiring it very much my business." Salvatore's men shifted nervously, clearly recognizing the significant escalation Ethan's presence represented to their previously straightforward intimidation operation. "We had no knowledge of your involvement," Salvatore said, his tone growing considerably more cautious. "You do now," Ethan said simply. "I suggest you and your men leave immediately and inform your organization that Ashford Development, along with everyone connected to it, now operates under my direct protection." Salvatore's jaw tightened with obvious frustration at this unexpected complication, though genuine fear was evident beneath his controlled exterior. "This isn't finished, Cross." "I'd recommend reconsidering that position," Ethan said calmly, though something sharp and dangerous flickered briefly behind his controlled expression. "My organization doesn't typically extend patience toward those who threaten families under our protection, and I assure you, I have considerably more resources at my disposal than your organization is prepared to challenge directly." The tense standoff continued for several more seconds before Salvatore, recognizing the genuine severity of the situation he now faced, gestured sharply to his men. They retreated from Richard's office with visible reluctance, their earlier confident menace replaced by careful, hurried departure. Once they'd gone, Richard released a long, shaky breath, genuine relief flooding through his exhausted body. "Is it over?" he asked. "For tonight," Ethan confirmed, "though I expect it will take somewhat longer to ensure the Moretti organization fully abandons their interest in your company's assets." "How can I possibly thank you for this?" Richard asked, genuine gratitude evident in his voice. Ethan considered the question carefully before responding. "You can start by genuinely examining the kind of person you become, Richard, not simply toward me, but toward everyone you dismissed or humiliated throughout your career based on superficial judgments about their worth or social standing." Richard absorbed this pointed observation with genuine humility, understanding clearly that Ethan's assistance came with expectations considerably more meaningful than simple gratitude. "I intend to," he said quietly. "This entire experience has forced me to confront things about my own character I've been avoiding examining for far too long." Over the following weeks, with the immediate threat from the Moretti organization successfully neutralized, Ethan's organization provided the financial assistance and business connections necessary to help stabilize Ashford Development's precarious situation. The arrangement was structured carefully, legitimate business terms rather than the kind of dangerous entanglement Richard might have feared given Ethan's criminal background. "Why structure it this way?" Richard asked during one of their now regular business meetings, genuinely curious about Ethan's careful insistence on maintaining strictly legitimate terms throughout their arrangement. "Because Elizabeth wouldn't have approved of me exploiting her brother's desperation for personal gain, regardless of how that brother initially treated me," Ethan said simply. "This assistance is offered in her memory, structured to genuinely help your company recover rather than trap you within obligations to my organization." Richard felt genuine emotion at this explanation, understanding increasingly the complicated, principled character underlying Ethan's dangerous reputation. "I owe you considerably more than simple business assistance," he said. "You saved my daughter, protected my family, and helped preserve my company despite everything I did to deserve exactly the opposite treatment." "Perhaps," Ethan acknowledged, "though I'd suggest the most meaningful way to honor that debt isn't through grand gestures or extravagant gratitude, but through genuine, ongoing change in how you treat people you might otherwise dismiss as beneath your notice or consideration." 6 months later, Ashford Development had stabilized significantly, its financial crisis fully resolved through the legitimate business partnerships Ethan had helped establish. Richard had implemented significant changes throughout his company's culture, extending genuine respect and fair treatment to employees and business partners regardless of their social standing or perceived usefulness to his interests. The annual charity gala, held once again to benefit the foundation established in Elizabeth's memory, took place with considerably more genuine warmth and inclusivity than the previous year's event had demonstrated. Richard personally ensured that every guest, regardless of their apparent social standing or wealth, received equal courtesy and respect throughout the evening. Ethan attended again, this time without disguise, his true identity and connection to Elizabeth's memory now openly acknowledged among the gathered guests. Richard greeted him personally at the entrance, genuine warmth evident in his expression rather than the dismissive cruelty that had characterized their initial encounter. "Thank you for coming," Richard said sincerely, "and for everything you've done for my family and company over these past months. Elizabeth will be pleased to see how genuinely you've grown," Ethan said, something warm and unguarded evident in his usually controlled expression. As the evening progressed, Richard watched Ethan move naturally through the crowd, guests now approaching him not with the fear his reputation might have once inspired, but with genuine respect earned through his quiet, principled character rather than simply his dangerous influence. Richard understood now, with clarity that had taken genuine crisis and humbling growth to fully absorb, that true respect couldn't be commanded through wealth, social standing, or intimidating reputation alone. It had to be earned through consistent character, genuine kindness, and the quiet strength to extend grace even toward those who had initially failed to recognize someone's genuine worth. Some lessons, Richard reflected, watching the warm, inclusive gathering honoring his sister's memory, arrived through the most unexpected and humbling circumstances imaginable, teaching truths considerably more valuable than any business success he'd previously measured his worth against.